All right, so Paul, as we have finished chapter 2, you may recall that he was addressing self-righteous Jewish people who were in this congregation, and they believed that righteousness was achieved by external works. By the way, there are many people today that still believe that righteousness is achieved by external works, so that's one thing that hasn't changed. But they believed that by following the Mosaic Law, that made them justified, that made them right with God. And the reality was that was not true. So as we finish all this criticism, you could say, that Paul is making of self-righteous Jewish people, Paul anticipated that they would have a question. And that's where we begin today as we start chapter 3. And that question ultimately is these Jewish people were thinking, what advantage do I have then? If I'm not, what does the Mosaic Law do for me if it doesn't save me? And that's really what the question was about. I mean, think about what was going on in their minds as they're reading this letter from Paul. The self-righteous Jewish people believed that by keeping this external Mosaic Law, that made them right with God. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of people that think that today. But Paul told them that the justification with God was an internal heart change through faith and a miracle by the Holy Spirit. Justification, just to clarify so we all understand what justification means. Justification is sort of a legal term. It's a declaration. Justification with God means that God looks at you and says, you are right with me. You are justified. You're right with me. So whatever it took to get to that point, they wanted to get there, but they thought that it was all about keeping the Mosaic Law. And the sad thing is that they missed the point. And many people today think getting right with God is about going to church. And church isn't a building. We call this the church, but the church is not a building. The church is the people that go to buildings generally every Sunday. But they missed that important point. And this truth led to the question that Paul is going to address in verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew? I mean, we've had this law for thousands of years, and we've made efforts to keep the law. Of course, the reality was the religious leaders of the day had added so many more commands to the law that in some cases it wasn't even recognizable. But they wanted to know, what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? Because, that was an important part of the Mosaic Law, although it started long before the law with Abraham. So the question is, if keeping the Mosaic Law didn't make a Jew right with God, then what advantage was there to having the Mosaic Law? If it didn't save us, what's the point? That's kind of like what they're asking. Why practice circumcision? And the reality is, if you have been paying attention what Paul was writing to these people, this is a legitimate question. And Paul anticipated it. So in verse 2 he wrote, great in every respect. So it's like there's many good reasons to having the Mosaic Law. But first of all, he says that they were entrusted, that is, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. And so the reality is that Paul focused on the fact that possessing and reading the Old Testament was a great advantage. Now, what advantage would it be to have the Old Testament? This is a question we can ask of ourselves today, because we live under the New Covenant. So what advantage is it to have the Old Covenant, to have the Old Testament to read? Well, let's start from the very beginning. What do we learn from Genesis? How we got here. We learn about creation in Genesis. It's described in the Old Testament. How did we get in this mess that we're in now? Well, we read about that in Genesis as well. We call it the fall. Adam and Eve sinned. In the Old Testament, it is described. In that same passage, we also learn that God already had a plan in place for salvation. We learn about the plan of salvation in the Old Testament. Keep in mind, Jesus lived every single day of his life under the Old Covenant. So it's all tied in together. The truth that salvation is by faith, not work, it's brought out in the Old Testament. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Salvation has always been about faith, not keeping rules and regulations. We also learn How the prophecies of how the Messiah is going to get here, that's in the Old Testament. We read the prophets and it talks about things like where he would be born, Bethlehem, that it would be a virgin birth. We learn about the lineage of the Messiah. We read again, still in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, we read of one lineage coming through Joseph. Now, Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. He was, to use modern terminology, he was the stepfather of Jesus. His line came through David. But wait a minute, that line that came through Joseph was cursed. So that meant that that person who would sit on the throne, the Messiah is going to be on the throne forever. But God cursed that branch of David's line, which was the last part of the southern kingdom. But wait a minute, there was another lineage that's recorded in the Gospels, still Old Testament, through Mary. Mary, you trace her lineage back, she also is a descendant of David. So that gives Jesus the right to sit on the throne because he is a son of David. How do we know that? Old Testament. So there's many advantages to having the Old Testament. And for us today who live under the new covenant, what we learn in the Old Testament is that God said there was coming a time when there was going to be a new covenant. And in that new covenant, according to Ezekiel chapter 36, that what God would do was that he would give people a new heart. He would give them a new spirit. And he would give them his spirit. All of that fulfilled in the new covenant, but we were told about it in the old covenant. We wouldn't know who the Messiah was without the old covenant. The old covenant is very important. And Paul wants the Jewish people to understand that. Just because the old covenant doesn't save you, it never did. Following the Mosaic Law, never saved a single person. But just because it doesn't save you doesn't mean it's not important. And this is what Paul wanted them to understand. So he talked about their objection and then explained why it was important. We move on to verse 3. What then? If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? So now we're talking about Jewish history. Well, if you've read the Old Testament, you know the Jewish history, and you know that the Jews were constantly unfaithful. I mean, they no more than came out of Egypt, and next thing you know, this golden calf miraculously by itself is coming out of the fire. Well, that's what Aaron said, because when Moses questions him about it, he says, we got all this gold, we put it in the fire, and out came the golden calf. Time out, Aaron. You're the one that created the thing. You fashioned it. Don't blame it just walked out of the fire. Don't go down that road. The history of Israel is a history of unfaithfulness. Read Judges. You see that cycle over and over again. They would get comfortable. They would forget about God. They would turn to idols. God would allow armies, the nations around them, to take them over. They would cry out to God for mercy. He would raise up a judge. The judge would defeat the enemies. He would lead them for a while. Then he would die. And then the cycle started all over again. Read about the kings of Israel, the northern kings. You know what? There was not one single king of the northern empire, later would just be referred to as Israel, not one single king that was faithful to God. They were all idolaters. There were some faithful kings in the southern kingdom, but for the most part, as you get towards the end, they just get worse and worse and worse. Until for the northern kingdom, the Assyrian army takes them into captivity. Finally, for the southern kingdom, you have the Babylonians that take them into captivity. It's a history of unfaithfulness. So Paul is asking this question, what shall we say? Because some of them obviously were unfaithful. So Israel's history was one of unfaithfulness. And their ultimate unfaithfulness was that they rejected their Messiah. Remember what John writes at the beginning of his gospel? He came unto his own, that's the Jewish people, and his own received him not. That's what they did. There were some Jewish people that believed, but as a nation, the vast majority of them rejected Jesus Christ. That's why 70 AD happens, because they rejected their Messiah. And Jesus told them when he looked at the temple, he says, the time is coming, not one single stone is going to be left setting upon another in that temple. And by the way, the Temple Mount, where Jewish people go today to pray, is not part of the temple. That temple was utterly obliterated by the Roman armies under Titus when he destroyed Jerusalem. More than 1 million people killed. Why? They rejected their Messiah. It's a nation that has a history of unfaithfulness. However, what Paul points out is their unfaithfulness did not nullify God's faithfulness. By the way, this is important for you and I as well. For all believers, all who have been born again. You and I know there are times when we were unfaithful or we are unfaithful. You know what? That doesn't negate God's faithfulness. It doesn't negate God's promises. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Who's bringing it to completion? You? Me? Haven't I? Help us if that's the way it's supposed to be, because none of us would make it. It's God who started the work, God who completes the work. Who do you think will bring you and I to glorification? God will. We have put our faith in Jesus Christ. We're now in Christ, but you and I know we're not always faithful, but God is. And that's the point that Paul is making. Even though Israel was unfaithful, that didn't change God's plan. He knew they would be unfaithful. It's not like God just kind of looked at Israel and said, oh my goodness, I never thought they would do this. God knew what was going to happen, but He used this plan of salvation to bring the Messiah into the world, even though Israel was unfaithful. So then Paul answers, he continues in verse 4. There we go. May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Once again, we know that Paul is addressing a Jewish audience. Why? Because look at what he says, as it is written. He wasn't talking about the Roman Herald, you know, the newspaper that they published every day. He wasn't talking about that. He's talking about the Old Testament as it is written. And specifically, the Jews should have known what Paul was talking about, because this comes from Psalm 51, which was David's confession after his sin with Bathsheba. I tell you, every Jew knew about King David. Every Jew also knew about his sin with Bathsheba. And Psalm 51 is David's confession after the sin. And he was confronted by Nathan. You remember the whole story about the guy who had just one little ewe lamb, and this other guy had all kinds of lambs, and somebody came and visited him, and he took that one lamb from that guy and fed it to him. And David gets all aroused and angry. He's like, that man will pay the price. And then Nathan points his finger at him and says, you're the man. You're the person we're talking about here. And David was like, caught. And in Psalm 51, this is David's confession. It's admission. David admitted his sin. He agreed that God was right after he got confronted by the prophet Nathan. God had the right to speak against him. God had the right to judge him, because even though David was unfaithful, God was not. And God was just in condemning David for what he did. Now, would the Gentiles have known Psalm 51? Nope. Would the Gentiles have known King David? Nope. They certainly would have not known Nathan who confronted him. But you and I know about that when we read the Old Testament. We know the stories, but you got to remember the Gentiles in that day didn't have the Bible like you and I do to read the Old Testament. The Jews did. And so once again we know that Paul is talking to or writing to a Jewish audience. I mean, who could judge God? No one could. Even if we're unfaithful, God is not unfaithful, and God has the right to condemn. On to verse 5. He writes, "But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is the God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he?" I am speaking in human terms. So what is David saying here? Theoretically, if their sin demonstrated how righteous God was, didn't that make God look better? I mean, that's the argument that they're making here. Well, yeah, we were unrighteous, but look how good we made God look over these years. And Paul's like, if that's your thinking, if that's your logic, you're really not getting it here. You're really not understanding what was going on. And if their sin made God look better, wasn't God therefore unrighteous or wrong if he punished the sin that made him look better? Hey, we made you look really good, God, and now you're punishing us for it? How is that working out? That's not fair. Ever people say that? Fair. That's not fair. You know what would happen to us if things were fair? We'd all be in hell. There was a time when our oldest son was very young, and he kept complaining about how things were not fair. So I said to Jonathan, all right, Jonathan, what we're going to do today, since you think things are not fair, is we're going to give you a fair day. Oh, by the way, that cereal that you're about to eat, I bought that cereal, so it's not fair that you eat my cereal. No, you can't have breakfast. Oh, by the way, you're doing this. I purchased it. Oh, wait a minute. You're living in my house. How much did you contribute to the house? Oh, well, all of this is just unfair, Jonathan. We need to have a fair day for you. He didn't get halfway through the day, and he came to me and said, Dad, I don't want a fair day anymore. And he still remembers that fair day. Be careful when you start claiming how unfair things are. Because if we got what was fair, Jesus wouldn't have been on the cross. It would have been us. The wages of sin is death. That's what we all deserve. That's what God told Adam in the garden. The day that you eat of that fruit, you will die. God didn't kill Adam. He didn't have to. That was the natural consequence. God stated what would happen, and it did. Now they're complaining because they're unrighteous, but they're making somehow, in their minds, they're making God look better. So how is it that God could punish them for their unrighteousness if they made him look better? So of course, Paul wrote from this human point of view. These self-righteous Jews had some really twisted thinking. So this was a ridiculous argument, which Paul made clear in the next sentence in verse 6. May it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? If God is unjust, how can God possibly judge the world? Old King James says, God forbid that would be true. If God overlooked sin for any reason, he would then be unjust. And how would he judge the world if he was unjust? Well, people say, well, God has overlooked my sin. I'm a Christian. No. Do not misunderstand. There was a high price paid for your sin. And it was that sin and the sin of the world that put Jesus on that cross. The price was paid. Death. His death. For us. It wasn't just overlooked. There was a high price that was paid. Jesus didn't just die on that cross. The scripture tells us that he who knew no sin became sin, so that we might be made the righteousness of God in Christ. That's what he did for us. It's not just he overlooked. God cannot overlook sin. The price must be paid. He continues in verse 7. But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? So what Paul is doing here is he is repeating their argument, but he's sort of phrasing it in a different way. The argument of his detractors at this point. If it was true that Paul's lies, according to them, about God's grace made God look better based on their rationalization, then why were his detractors judging him? I mean, Paul's just kind of taking their argument and turning it back around to them. How are you judging me if you really believe what you say? Because if I'm saying it's God's grace and that's a lie, well, my lie, isn't that making God look better because of my unrighteousness? Doesn't God look better according to your argument? So how do you judge me then? How do you criticize me? Their rationalization of sin made God look better. So Paul's lies in their minds about grace made God look better. So why would they judge him? Then Paul adds in verse 8, and why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim that way, let us do evil that good may come. Their condemnation is just. You kind of see Paul's frustration coming out in here. And we look at this and it's like Paul suggested the self-righteous agree with the other slanderers and detractors who said do evil so that God may abound. You got to understand that as Paul went on these missionary journeys, there were groups of Jewish people that constantly hounded him, constantly tried to stir up trouble, and they made accusations against Paul to the Jewish synagogues that Paul would go to. When he went to the Gentiles, they weren't satisfied that he went to the Gentiles. They didn't want Gentiles to be saved. It was only about the Jewish people, their God, their law, their Moses, not those Gentiles. So they constantly harassed Paul. And this whole thing about doing evil to somehow produce good was one of the accusations they made against Paul to Jewish congregations, to Jewish synagogues. And that's what Paul is addressing here. He added that those who believe evil produce good, you know what they deserved? Just condemnation. How ridiculous, how foolish to believe that my sin is going to bring about good. It doesn't work that way. Then Paul added that there are none who are inherently righteous. Not a single person. We move on to the next section here. Verse 9, Paul says, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. So were the Jews in general better than those who thought that evil produced good? Were Jews in general better than them? Furthermore, were the Jews in general better than the Gentiles? Weren't they better because they had the Mosaic Law? Because they had the covenants of God? Weren't they better than that? And Paul is saying, we already established the fact that everybody has done wrong. The self-righteous, the Gentiles, we've already established that fact. There were Jews, they were not better than the Gentiles. Paul made it clear that all Jews and Gentiles were what? Under sin. Meaning, everyone entered life not right with God. Sometimes we call it original sin. But the fact is, you don't have to teach your children how to sin. They learn it by themselves. You don't have to teach a child when you say, I heard that cookie jar. Are you getting in the cookies? No, not me. That was my brother. We don't have to teach children how to lie. We don't have to teach children how to be deceitful. What we have to do is to teach them to do what is right. We have to instill it in their lives. There is right and there is wrong. We have to teach it to them. But it comes natural for them to not do what is right. And so we see here that Paul made it clear that all were under the umbrella of sin. And what is he doing? He's going to quote from the Old Testament again to make his point. And he's going to use a number of different quotes. Most of them are coming from the Psalms. One of them comes from Isaiah. How many Gentiles would have known the Psalms? 0. How many Jews would have known the Psalms? All of them. How many Gentiles would have known who the prophet Isaiah was? 0. How many Jews would have known who Isaiah was? Probably all of them. If they were raised in a synagogue, they would have known who Isaiah was. So, again, Paul is quoting from Scripture. Why? Because he's addressing a predominantly Jewish audience. And it's important to note that every single one of these Scriptures refers to an unbeliever. This is somebody who has rejected God, who has rejected God's plan for Israel, and in some cases rejected David as the king. They're all about unbelievers. In some places it says that these people said, God doesn't even exist. There is no God. So they were atheists. Others were enemies of God, enemies of King David, and some wanted to kill David and destroy Israel. The point is, you can't understand Paul's point if you ignore this fact. He's talking about unbelievers. But the fact about unbelievers is this: they don't have to stay that way. But that's who we're dealing with. And Paul's point is this: you can't become right by keeping law, rules and regulations. So we look at verses 10 through 12 to begin with. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good, not even one. Now, in God's eyes and from His perspective, an unbeliever, this is what is being described here. This is an unbeliever. So in the first part, Paul paraphrased and combined Psalm 14 verses 1 through 3 and Psalm 53 verses 1 through 3. If you have a reference Bible, those references are probably there by that passage. The first verse of each of these Psalms says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." You know what? That hasn't changed. There are a lot of people in this world that just don't believe God exists. The problem is that God gets blamed for a lot of things He's not responsible for. And so people just, God just doesn't exist. How could God exist if this, and this, you just fill in the blank? Unbelievers, atheists. Now, Paul didn't include that part of the passage in his quote. Why not? Because the Jews would have been familiar with the Psalms, and they would have known, most likely, that he's talking about unbelievers. In this case, people that don't even believe that God exists. So it wasn't necessary for Paul to quote that part of the Psalm. It's the beginning of the Psalm. Here's the problem with modern Christians. Many times they don't go back and look at the Psalm. They don't look at the context of the Psalm. So they make theological decisions based on Psalms taken out of context. And they completely ignore that he's just talking about unbelievers, whether Jew or Gentile. They're unbelievers. They don't believe that God exists. They want to fight against Israel and King David. But people don't have to stay unbelievers. What does it require? Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. It's that simple. You know, Paul doesn't say anything about works of law in that passage in Romans 10. Doesn't say anything about works of law. It's about faith in what God has done. So every Jew or Gentile who didn't believe that God existed was lost, and they're under sin. In God's eyes, there's nothing they could do good. Why? Because they have rejected God. You can't please a God that you don't believe exists. It just doesn't work that way. So Paul continues. Verse 13, the first part. Their throat is an open grave, and with their tongues they keep deceiving. So this time Paul referred to Psalm 5, verse 9. So a person who rejected the existence of God was an enemy of God and had words that amounted to death and lies, spiritually speaking. You know, an atheist can actually teach true things. It's possible. But when it comes to spirituality, the atheist only produces death and lies. The atheist only produces death and lies because they have rejected the existence of God. So there's nothing that they can do spiritually that is good. He continues, the poison of asps is under their lips. From this Psalm 140, verse 3, this unbeliever devised evil and spoke spiritual poison. Again, an unbeliever, spiritually speaking, what's coming out of their mouth spiritually is poison. It's untrue from a spiritual perspective. You listen to the atheists when they talk about spirituality, and it is going to poison your mind to the truth. Unfortunately, what we have in many of our colleges and universities today is you have Christian kids going to these colleges and universities, and they listen for 4 years to their atheist professors, and they come out of the college doubting that God even exists. You listen to the wrong person, and it's going to have damaging consequences. Verse 14, he continues, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. This is Psalm 10, verse 7. And this was another passage about a person who did not believe that God existed. What came out of their mouth? Cursing and bitterness. 15 through 17, he continues. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and they have not known the way of peace. This is the one where he's quoting from Isaiah. Isaiah 59:7 is what he is referring to here. And he referred to unbelievers who had set their minds to do evil. The fact is, if you're an unbeliever and you determine that you're going to cause evil and chaos, you focus your mind on that, guess what's going to happen? Exactly what you want. Evil and chaos. Verse 18, he continues. There is no fear of God before their eyes. The final reference is Psalm 36, verse 1. Once again, this is an unbeliever who does not fear God. I mean, think about this. If you don't believe God exists, why would you fear God? And the Psalms teach, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Proverbs teaches the same thing. It's the very beginning. You have to believe that God exists if you're going to get to a place where you are right with God. That's the beginning of it. So then Paul addressed anyone in verse 19 who is under law. He says, now we know that whenever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world become accountable to God. Now, when we look at this, if you notice in the translation that I'm using, the New American Standard, the word law is capitalized. And oftentimes when people see that, they think, well, he must be talking about the Mosaic Law. But in order to understand what Paul is saying here, we have to go back in the Scripture. Back when he has already written to the Roman audience. And so the Jews were under the law of Moses. But the Gentiles, as Paul said in chapter 2, verse 14, had a law as well. A law to themselves. Again, the law was only given to the Jewish people. It was only given to Israel. The law was never given to the Gentiles. But that didn't mean the Gentiles didn't have a law. They did. You go to any civilization around the world, even uncivilized people around the world, and what do they have in their societies? Rules. They all have rules. Whether it be the Mosaic Law or whether it be Gentile law, the Romans had rules. The Greeks had rules. They all had rules. Persians, rules. Babylonians, Assyrians, they all had rules. Egyptians all had rules. So we have to understand the perspective that Paul is talking about here. Yes, he's talking to those under the Mosaic Law, but he's also talking to those who were under natural law, human law. And here's the point that he is making. We need to understand it. The Jewish law and the Gentile law closed every mouth because everyone broke their law. Whether it was the Mosaic Law, there was not a single person, minus Jesus, that ever kept the Mosaic Law perfectly. Jesus was the only one. Every ordinary human that was a Jew broke the Mosaic Law. That's why they had the Day of Atonement. So they could get a year's worth of forgiveness. But it had to be repeated year after year after year. Gentiles also had laws, and they broke their laws too. No one ever didn't break a law. Let me ask you this. When you get on the highway, how often do you break the law? Well, you can go 5 over. Broke the law. When you stop, when you leave here, Dave, when you leave here, do you use your turn signal every time you're making a turn? If you don't, the Enon police may follow you home and put their finger in your face and say, you violated the law 3 times. If you get to that stop sign at the end of the street and you don't make a complete stop, which is 3 seconds, 1001, 1002, 1003. Oh, and if there's a line in the road, you're supposed to stop on this side of the line, not go all the way to the corner. You stop before the white line, then you can inch forward to the corner after you made a complete stop. Not a California stop. A law stop. Don't tell me no one is perfect when it comes to law. No one. And that's what Paul is saying. No one is perfect. Whether it's a Jew under the Mosaic Law or whether it is a Gentile under the human law, they have all broken the law and therefore they are all under sin. And you know what the law does? It condemns. When was the last time you saw those lights flashing behind you and the state police is pulling you over? And as he gets out of his car and he walks up to you, you got your license and registration ready, and you got the window down, you got your hands on the steering wheel. And the officer says to you, I just wanted to thank you for doing 65 miles an hour. I pulled you over to thank you, to commend you. Because not many people, people think that you can go 5 over. But the law says you can only go 65. And you saw that sign that said the speed limit was going from 70 to 65. I watched you. I was following you. And I noticed that you slowed down before you got to 65. You did it perfectly. And I just want to commend you. Matter of fact, I'm going to give you a ticket of commendation. Has that ever happened? No. Because the law doesn't commend. The law condemns. Did you know that you were doing 75 in a 55 zone? No, officer, I didn't. Well, you were. When's the last time you calibrated your radar? Don't you just want to say that? But you know that just makes it worse. Yes, officer. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, sir. That's what you got to do. The law condemns. The Mosaic Law never saved anyone. Why? Because it wasn't designed to save. The Mosaic Law was designed to establish a nation under laws, and that nation's purpose was to honor God by keeping those laws, and ultimately for the Messiah to be brought into the world through that nation. And that's only one nation. It is Israel. And despite the fact that they were unfaithful, all the Jews knew that. They just read the history of the Jewish nation. It didn't nullify God's faithfulness. He brought the Messiah into the world. He sent it to the Jews. They rejected them. They put him on a cross. But the Gentiles were a part of that too, weren't they? Because it was technically the Romans who nailed him to the cross. We are all under the condemnation of sin. Later, Paul will get into that statement. We all deserve condemnation because we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And Paul is just wanting them to understand. These Jews and Gentiles, they're closed. The law closes your mouth because they all broke the law. Since Jews and Gentiles were both under law and all broke the law, no one escaped accountability of their law to God or even accountability to mankind. They just didn't escape it. The Jews knew right from wrong from the Mosaic Law. The Gentiles knew right from law from conscience and from the law in their communities. Both groups were under law. Both groups broke the law. Both groups were accountable to God because they broke the law. Verse 20, he says, because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. What does the law do? It says, you broke the law. The officer says, you didn't use your turn signal 3 times. The law says that. It condemns. And it gives us knowledge of right and wrong. But it doesn't save us. And there's the problem. There's no amount of law that ever saved anyone. No one was justified or declared right, because that's what justification means, by works of the law, whether it was law that was Mosaic or Gentile law. Everyone failed under their law. And rather than fix sin, law clearly gave knowledge of sin because it pointed out sin. And you know what law also does? It reacts with us. Our flesh reacts to law. So as I've said many times, when you see that sign on the bench that says, wet paint, do not touch, what does the law reacting with the law's good, but it reacts with the flesh and sin that is within us. And what do we want to do? Well, the first thing we always do is, no, you look around. You see if anybody's watching. And then when no one's watching you, you go, oh yeah, it's wet. So that's what law does. So it doesn't save, it condemns. And so they needed to have another way to fix the problem. And as we continue on in Romans, as he's talking to this Jewish audience, it's not that there were no Gentiles, but it's primarily a Jewish audience. He's going to show the way that what the law could not do, faith in Jesus Christ did. And that's what he did on the cross. And he's going to get there. But he's not done with them yet. There's still more that he's going to kind of hand out to them, and we'll get that, Lord willing, in Sundays to come. But that's where we finish up today. And the fact is that law will never save you. Only faith in Jesus Christ does. And that's what we need to understand.